31 serial killers who were never identified or caught. Throughout history, some serial killers seem to vanish into thin air, leaving behind victims, evidence, and unanswered questions. These weren't ordinary criminals. They were predators who operated for years, sometimes decades, without ever being identified or caught. Despite modern forensic science, massive investigations, and relentless detective work, these killers either disappeared or died without being named. They taunted police, stopped suddenly, or simply blended back into society. This is 31 serial killers who were never identified or apprehended, proving that even in an age of DNA, surveillance, and advanced technology, some murderers escape justice forever. Number 1. Jack the Ripper. Between August and November 1888, at least 5 women were brutally murdered in London's Whitechapel district. The killer, who became known as Jack the Ripper, sent taunting letters to police and newspapers, some possibly genuine. Despite massive police efforts and public panic, the killer was never caught. The murders displayed anatomical knowledge, leading to speculation about the killer's profession. Over 130 years later, despite countless investigations, DNA analysis attempts, and hundreds of suspects proposed, we still don't know who Jack the Ripper was. The case remains the most famous unsolved serial killing in history. Suspects have ranged from local butchers to doctors to members of the royal family, but no conclusive evidence has ever identified the killer. The Ripper simply stopped killing and vanished, leaving one of criminology's greatest mysteries. Number 2. The Zodiac Killer. Between 1968 and 1969, the Zodiac Killer murdered at least 5 people in Northern California, though he claimed 37 victims. What made this case particularly chilling was that the killer sent encrypted letters to newspapers, including ciphers that took decades to solve. He taunted police, provided details only the killer would know, and seemed to enjoy the attention. Despite one of the most extensive investigations in California history, the Zodiac was never caught. Modern DNA analysis, handwriting analysis, and advanced cryptography have all been applied to the case. In 2020, one cipher was finally decoded after 51 years, but it didn't reveal the killer's identity. The case remains open, with new suspects proposed regularly, but the Zodiac killer's identity remains unknown. He simply stopped communicating and was never heard from again. Number 3. The Axeman of New Orleans. Between May 1918 and October 1919, an unknown killer terrorized New Orleans, breaking into homes and attacking residents with axes or straight razors. The Axeman sent a letter to newspapers claiming to be a demon and stating he would spare anyone playing jazz music on a specific night. The city erupted in jazz music that evening. The attacks targeted Italian grocers primarily, leading to theories about organized crime or ethnic targeting. The Axeman killed at least 6 people and injured many more before the attacks suddenly stopped in October 1919. Despite extensive investigation, the killer was never identified. Some historians believe the Axeman may have died or been imprisoned for another crime, but no definitive evidence exists. The case remains unsolved over a century later, with the killer's identity lost to history. Number 4. The Servant Girl Annihilator. Between December 1884 and December 1885, someone murdered at least 8 women in Austin, Texas, in brutal nighttime attacks. The victims were primarily African-American servant women, leading to the killer's nickname. The murders involved axes or knives, and several victims were dragged from their beds. The final attacks targeted white women from prominent families, causing citywide panic. The killing stopped suddenly on Christmas Eve 1885 after the murder of 2 white women. Police never identified a suspect despite intensive investigation. Some researchers have speculated the same killer may have later become Jack the Ripper, though this theory is highly disputed. Regardless, the Servant Girl Annihilator was never caught, and the case remains unsolved nearly 140 years later. Number 5. Bible John. In the late 1960s, 3 young women were murdered after leaving the Barrowland Ballroom in Glasgow, Scotland. Witnesses described a man seen with the victims who quoted the Bible extensively, leading to the nickname Bible John. Despite extensive police work, including Scotland's largest manhunt, the killer was never identified. The murders stopped after the third victim in 1969, leading to speculation the killer died, moved away, or was imprisoned for other crimes. Modern DNA analysis has been attempted, but results have been inconclusive. Several suspects have been proposed over the decades, but none definitively proven. Bible John remains one of Scotland's most notorious unsolved serial killer cases, with the investigation still technically open. Number 6. The Freeway Phantom. Between April 1971 and September 1972, 6 young African-American girls were abducted, assaulted, and murdered in Washington, D.C. The victims were taken from public areas, held captive, and their bodies left near freeways. One victim had a note in her pocket apparently written under duress, suggesting the killer forced her to write it. Despite extensive investigation by D.C. police and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the killer was never identified. The case received less media attention than similar cases involving white victims, a disparity that became controversial. The murders stopped suddenly, and no conclusive suspect was ever identified. The Freeway Phantom case remains open, representing a tragic failure of justice for the victims and their families. Number 7. The Doodler. Between January 1974 and September 1975, a serial killer murdered at least 5 men, and possibly as many as 14 in San Francisco. The victims were gay men who met the killer at bars or through social connections. The killer earned his nickname because several surviving victims reported he sketched them before attacking. The Doodler targeted the gay community during an era when many victims were reluctant to come forward due to stigma. Despite having descriptions from survivors and sketch artists' renderings, police never identified the killer. The murders stopped in 1975 for unknown reasons. San Francisco police believe they know the killer's identity but lack sufficient evidence to prosecute. The case remains technically open, with the Doodler never officially identified or caught, despite being one of the most prolific serial killers in San Francisco history. Number 8. The Phantom Killer of Texarkana. In spring 1946, someone committed a series of attacks in Texarkana on the Texas-Arkansas border. Over 10 weeks, 8 people were shot, 5 fatally in isolated areas. The attacks occurred every 3 weeks, primarily targeting couples in parked cars at night. The killer wore a white hood with eye holes, leading to the nickname Phantom Killer. Despite a massive investigation involving Texas Rangers and local police, the killer was never identified. The attack stopped suddenly after May 1946. A suspect named Yoel Swinney was investigated, but never charged due to insufficient evidence. The case remains unsolved over 75 years later. The Phantom Killer's identity died with whoever committed these crimes, leaving one of Texas's most notorious unsolved cases. Number 9. The Monster of Florence. Between 1968 and 1985, someone murdered at least 16 people in the Florence, Italy area. The victims were couples in parked cars in isolated areas, killed with the same gun. The murders were brutal and involved mutilation. The case became one of Italy's most notorious unsolved crimes, generating massive media attention and multiple false suspects. Several men were arrested and imprisoned over the years, but many believe the real killer was never caught. The murders stopped in 1985, but whether because the killer died, moved, or stopped is unknown. The case involved multiple botched investigations, false confessions, and conspiracy theories. Despite decades of investigation, the true identity of the Monster of Florence remains unknown, making it one of Europe's most infamous unsolved serial killer cases. Number 10. The Long Island Serial Killer. In December 2010, police searching for a missing woman discovered 10 sets of human remains along Ocean Parkway on Long Island, New York. The victims were primarily women who worked as escorts, and evidence suggested a single killer was responsible. The discovery shocked the community and launched a massive investigation. Despite extensive investigation, advanced forensics, and public attention, the case remained unsolved for over a decade. In 2023, a suspect named Rex Heuermann was arrested and charged with some of the murders. But as of this writing, he has not been convicted, and questions remain about whether he's responsible for all the deaths. For years, this killer operated with impunity, and complete justice has not yet been definitively achieved. Number 11. The Highway of Tears Killer. Along Highway 16 in British Columbia, Canada, dozens of women and girls have disappeared or been found murdered since 1970. Most victims were Indigenous women hitchhiking along the isolated highway. While some cases have been solved and attributed to different killers, many remain unsolved, and investigators believe at least one serial killer may be responsible for multiple deaths. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police have investigated extensively, but the remote location, transient population, and time span make the case incredibly difficult. The fact that many victims were Indigenous women whose cases received less attention initially has been controversial. While some perpetrators have been caught, experts believe at least one or more serial killers remain unidentified. The Highway of Tears represents multiple unsolved cases spanning decades. Number 12. The Stoneman of Kolkata and Bombay. In the late 1980s, someone murdered homeless people in Kolkata, India, by dropping heavy stones on their heads while they slept. At least 13 people were killed. After the Kolkata murders stopped, similar murders began in Bombay, now called Mumbai, with at least 12 more victims. The pattern was identical: homeless people killed with heavy stones while sleeping on sidewalks. Despite investigations by Indian police, the killer was never identified. The murders stopped suddenly in both cities. The fact that similar murders occurred in two cities hundreds of miles apart suggested either one killer traveling between cities or a copycat. The Stoneman was never caught, and the case remains one of India's most disturbing unsolved serial killing cases. Number 13. The Connecticut River Valley Killer. Between 1978 and 1987, 7 women were murdered in New Hampshire and Vermont along the Connecticut River. The victims were stabbed, and several were found in similar locations. The murders showed similarities suggesting a single killer, though police have never officially confirmed this. The rural nature of the area and time gaps between murders made investigation difficult. Despite extensive efforts by multiple law enforcement agencies, the killer was never identified. Several suspects have been investigated over the years, but none definitively connected to all the murders. The case remains open, and the Connecticut River Valley killer's identity remains unknown. The murders stopped in 1987, leading to speculation the killer died, moved away, or was imprisoned for other crimes. Number 14. The Oakland County Child Killer. Between 1976 and 1977, 4 children were abducted and murdered in Oakland County, Michigan. The victims were held captive for days before being killed, and their bodies carefully placed in public locations. The killer appeared to care for the children before killing them, feeding them and keeping them clean. The case terrified parents across Michigan. Despite a massive investigation and numerous suspects, the killer was never identified. Some evidence suggested the killer might have been someone with authority or trust in the community. The murders stopped suddenly after the 4th victim, leading to various theories about why. The Oakland County child killer case remains one of Michigan's most notorious unsolved cases, with families still seeking answers over 45 years later. Number 15. The Bear Brook Murders Kill. In 1985 and 2000, barrels containing the bodies of 4 females were discovered in Bear Brook State Park in New Hampshire. DNA analysis revealed they were 2 women and 2 young girls, and they'd been murdered years before discovery. Advanced genetic genealogy eventually identified the victims, but the killer's identity remained unknown for decades. In 2017, authorities identified Terry Petter Rasmussen as the killer through genetic genealogy. However, Rasmussen had died in prison in 2010 while serving time for another murder, never having been charged with the Bear Brook murders. While technically identified after death, Rasmussen was never caught for these specific crimes and died without facing justice for them. His case shows how some killers escape justice simply by dying before identification. Number 16. The Chicago Strangler. Between 2001 and 2018, over 50 women were strangled in Chicago, primarily in the South and West Sides. The victims were predominantly African American women, many involved in sex work or struggling with addiction. While Chicago police officially denied a serial killer was responsible, patterns in the murders suggested otherwise to many investigators and journalists. No one has been definitively identified as responsible for these murders. Some cases have been attributed to different perpetrators, but many remain unsolved. The controversy around whether police adequately investigated because of the victims' demographics has been significant. Whether one killer or multiple, someone murdered dozens of vulnerable women in Chicago, and justice has not been served. Many of these cases remain open and unsolved. Number 17. Jack the Stripper. Between 1964 and 1965, 6 women who worked as prostitutes were murdered in London. The victims were found nude, strangled, and showed evidence of being kept somewhere before being dumped. The killer was nicknamed Jack the Stripper by the media, drawing comparisons to Jack the Ripper. The murders caused panic in London's red light districts. Police investigated intensively, but the killer was never identified. The murders stopped abruptly after the 6th victim in February 1965. One theory suggests a suspect committed suicide before being arrested, but this was never confirmed. Another theory suggests the suspect was a respected member of the community who couldn't be prosecuted due to lack of evidence. Jack the Stripper's identity remains unknown 60 years later. Number 18. The Alphabet Murders Killer. Between 1971 and 1973, 3 young girls were murdered in Rochester, New York. Each victim had a first and last name starting with the same letter: Carmen Colon, Wanda Wakovich, and Michelle Minza. They were found in towns beginning with the same letter as their names. This unusual pattern suggested deliberate selection by the killer. Despite extensive investigation, including involvement by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the killer was never identified. A suspect named Kenneth Bianchi, who later became known as the Hillside Strangler, was investigated but cleared. Another suspect, Dennis Termini, was investigated but never charged. The murders stopped after the 3rd victim, and the case remains unsolved 50 years later. The Alphabet Murders killer was never caught. Number 19. The Colonial Parkway Killer. Between 1986 and 1989, 4 couples were murdered along or near the Colonial Parkway in Virginia. The victims were found in or near their vehicles, and the murders showed similarities suggesting a single killer. The case received significant attention due to the scenic location and the targeting of couples. One couple has never been found, only their vehicle. Despite investigation by Virginia State Police and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the killer was never identified. Several suspects have been investigated over the years, but none definitively connected to all the murders. The case remains open, and the Colonial Parkway killer's identity remains unknown. Families of the victims continue advocating for renewed investigation and answers. Number 20. The Frankfurt Slasher. Between 1985 and 1990, someone murdered at least 9 women in the Frankfurt neighborhood of Philadelphia. The victims were primarily older women who lived alone, and they were sexually assaulted and stabbed. The murders terrorized the neighborhood for years. A man named Leonard Christopher was convicted of one of the murders and suspected in others, but he died in prison in 1990. Many investigators believe Christopher wasn't responsible for all the murders, and the real Frankfurt slasher may have never been caught. Murders matching the pattern continued even after Christopher's arrest. The case remains controversial, with questions about whether Christopher was the sole killer or if someone else escaped justice. The Frankfurt slasher case represents a possible failure of justice where the real killer may have continued operating. Number 21. The Honolulu Strangler. Between 1985 and 1986, 5 women were murdered in Honolulu, Hawaii. The victims were strangled, and their bodies were left in various locations around Oahu. The murders caused fear across the island, particularly among women living alone. Despite investigation by Honolulu police, the killer was never definitively identified. Several suspects were investigated, but no one was ever charged. The murders stopped suddenly in 1986, leading to theories that the killer died, moved away, or was imprisoned for other crimes. Some investigators believe they know the killer's identity but lack sufficient evidence to prosecute. The Honolulu Strangler case remains technically open, with the killer never officially caught or identified. Number 22. The Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. Between 1934 and 1938, someone murdered and dismembered at least 12 people in Cleveland, Ohio. The victims' bodies were found in pieces, often near Kingsbury Run. The killer displayed surgical skill in dismembering victims, leading to speculation about medical training. The case attracted national attention and frustrated famous lawman Eliot Ness, who was Cleveland's safety director at the time. Despite Ness's involvement and extensive investigation, the killer was never caught. One suspect, Frank Dolezal, was arrested but died in custody under suspicious circumstances, and evidence suggested he wasn't the real killer. Another suspect, Dr. Francis Sweeney, was investigated but never charged. The murders stopped after Sweeney was committed to a mental institution, but this was never proven. The Mad Butcher's identity remains unknown 85 years later. Number 23. The Eastbound Strangler. Between 2006 and 2007, 4 women who worked as prostitutes were murdered in Atlantic City, New Jersey. The victims were found behind a motel and all had been strangled. The pattern suggested a serial killer targeting vulnerable women. Despite investigation, no suspect was identified, and the case went cold. In 2016, additional bodies were discovered in the same area, though whether connected to the original murders remains unclear. The Eastbound Strangler case remains unsolved, with no arrests made. The targeting of marginalized women and the lack of resolution has drawn criticism regarding police priorities. The killer was never caught, and the investigation continues without significant leads. Number 24. The Redhead Murders Killer. Between 1978 and 1992, the bodies of numerous unidentified women and girls with red or reddish hair were found along highways across several states including Tennessee, Arkansas, Kentucky, Mississippi, and Pennsylvania. The victims showed signs of being murdered, and the pattern suggested possible serial killer involvement, though this has never been confirmed. Most victims were never identified, making investigation extremely difficult. No one was ever caught or charged in connection with these murders. Whether one killer or multiple perpetrators, someone murdered numerous vulnerable women whose identities and stories remain unknown. The Redhead murders represent one of the most mysterious series of unsolved killings in American history. Number 25. The West Mesa Bone Collector. In 2009, the bodies of 11 women and 1 unborn child were discovered buried in the desert on Albuquerque's West Mesa. The victims had been missing between 2001 and 2005, and many had been involved in sex work or struggled with addiction. The discovery shocked New Mexico and launched a major investigation. Despite extensive investigation, DNA analysis, and public appeals, the killer has never been identified. No arrests have been made, and the case remains open. The targeting of vulnerable women and the length of time the killer operated without detection has raised questions about investigative priorities. The West Mesa bone collector remains unidentified, representing a significant failure of justice for the victims and their families. Number 26. The I-70 Killer. Between April and May 1992, someone shot and killed 6 people working alone in stores along or near Interstate 70, spanning Indiana, Missouri, and Kansas. The victims were shot with a .22 caliber firearm, and robberies appeared secondary to murder. The pattern suggested a killer traveling the interstate system. Despite investigation by multiple jurisdictions and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the killer was never identified. Composite sketches were created based on witness descriptions, but no suspect was ever caught. The murders stopped suddenly, leading to theories the killer died, was imprisoned for other crimes, or simply stopped. The I-70 killer case remains unsolved 30 years later. Number 27. The Volga Maniac. Between 1990 and 2000, someone murdered at least 32 elderly women in Kazan, Russia. The killer broke into apartments, robbed, assaulted, and murdered the victims. Despite the high body count and long investigation, Russian police never identified the killer. The case is complicated by Russian authorities' reluctance to acknowledge serial killers during certain periods. The Volga Maniac was never caught, and the investigation remains officially open, though little active work continues. The targeting of vulnerable elderly women living alone made this particularly disturbing. Whether the killer died, moved, or was imprisoned for other crimes remains unknown. The case represents one of Russia's most prolific unsolved serial killer cases. Number 28. The Puget Sound Schoolgirl Killer. Between 1979 and 1981, 3 teenage girls were murdered in the Puget Sound area of Washington state. The victims vanished while traveling between locations, and their bodies were later found. Despite investigation, no suspect was ever identified or caught. A serial killer named Robert Lee Yates was investigated for these crimes but cleared. Another killer, Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, was also investigated but wasn't connected to these specific murders. The killer remains unidentified, suggesting a separate perpetrator who was never caught. The case remains open, and the families have never received justice or closure. These murders remain some of Washington's most frustrating unsolved cases. Number 29. The Rainbow Maniac. Between 2007 and 2008, at least 13 people were shot and killed in Pacharis Park in Carapicuíba, Brazil. The victims were primarily gay men or people perceived to be gay, leading to the nickname Rainbow Maniac. The murders terrorized the LGBTQ community in the area. A retired police officer named Jero Francisco Franco was arrested and confessed to the murders. However, Franco later recanted his confession, claiming he was tortured. He was convicted of 2 murders but acquitted of others. Many investigators believe the real Rainbow Maniac was never caught and that Franco may have been wrongly convicted. The case remains controversial, with questions about whether justice was truly served or if the real killer remains free. Number 30. The Daytona Beach Killer. Between 2005 and 2007, 4 women who worked as prostitutes were murdered and their bodies left in Daytona Beach, Florida. The pattern suggested serial killer involvement, though police initially denied this. Despite investigation, no suspect was identified and the case went cold. In 2020, additional evidence was analyzed, but still no arrests have been made. The case remains open and unsolved. The targeting of vulnerable women and the initial police denial of serial killer involvement has been controversial. The Daytona Beach Killer was never caught, and the investigation continues without significant resolution or justice for the victims. Number 31. The Jeff Davis 8. Between 2005 and 2009, 8 women were murdered in Jefferson Davis Parish, Louisiana. The victims knew each other, shared similar backgrounds of poverty and drug addiction, and were found in similar locations. The murders raised questions about whether a serial killer was responsible or if the deaths were connected to drug trafficking or police corruption. Multiple investigations, including by journalists and filmmakers, have examined the case. Despite extensive scrutiny, no one has been definitively identified as responsible. Theories range from a single serial killer to multiple perpetrators to a cover-up of deaths related to drug trade. The Jeff Davis 8 case remains one of Louisiana's most controversial unsolved cases, with questions about whether authorities adequately investigated or protected certain suspects. Justice has never been served. So there you have it, 31 serial killers who were never identified or caught, demonstrating that despite all our modern investigative techniques, forensic science, and law enforcement resources, some criminals successfully evade justice. From Victorian London to modern America, from India to Italy, these cases span continents and decades, united by one disturbing fact: the killers were never brought to justice. What makes these cases so troubling isn't just the violence, it's the failure of justice. Families never received closure. Communities never received certainty that the danger had passed. Victims never received justice. These killers either died without being identified, stopped killing for unknown reasons, or possibly continue living freely, their crimes unpunished. These cases teach us sobering lessons. First, that no matter how advanced our technology becomes, human cunning and luck can still defeat investigation. Second, that society's treatment of victims matters. Many of these cases involved marginalized people whose murders weren't initially taken seriously enough. Third, that serial killers can be anyone, living seemingly normal lives while secretly committing atrocities. Perhaps most disturbingly, these cases remind us that some killers simply get away with it, not because they're brilliant criminal masterminds necessarily, but because investigation is difficult, evidence is sometimes lacking, and circumstances align in their favor. Some stopped before making the mistake that would expose them. Others benefited from investigative failures or jurisdictional complications. Some just got lucky. Many of these cases remain technically open. DNA technology continues improving, and cold cases are occasionally solved decades later using genetic genealogy and new techniques. Perhaps someday, some of these killers will be identified, even posthumously. But for now, they represent justice denied and mysteries unsolved. Which case troubles you most? Do you believe some of these cases will eventually be solved with advancing technology? What do you think can be done to prevent future serial killers from escaping justice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspectives on these disturbing unsolved cases.